Hi everyone, this is Arthi from Human Chapters. I'll tell you a bit about human chapters. Humans are living narratives with the past, present, and future. These narratives constitute of a number of chapters across a lifespan. The aim of these conversations is to highlight a chapter of the narrative and unpack its connections to other chapters. I don't care whether people are natural storytellers, but I truly do believe each one of us has a worthy story to share. An acknowledgement to country. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are. We pay respect to their tribal elders, past and present and emerging. We celebrate the continuing culture and we acknowledge the memory of their ancestors. And today, our guest is Brittany. Brittany is from Rhode Island, and her chapter is Language and Literacy Connections. Awesome. I'll pass it over to you, Brittany.
Okay, thanks for introducing me. My name is Brittany Chulo, and I am a speech language pathologist, and I currently live in Providence, Rhode Island. And this is my fourth year being a speech therapist, but I have been correcting people's grammar for almost 30 years. So it was sort of a natural career path for me. So I love to talk about my work and I welcome any opportunity to do so. So I'm excited to be here. But aside from my speech life, I also am really interested in music. And so I play piano and I play some guitar and I love to sing. And I'm always thinking about how that's sort of a language of its own too. And thinking about communication, how it's sort of a mixture of rules and art, and like music and language both seem to fit that definition for me. So anyway, that got super deep, super quick, but that's a little bit about me.
That's wonderful. So, Brittany, why did you become a speech and language pathologist? What? Yeah.
So I have always been interested in speech and language. In school, I always loved English class. I loved learning about independent and dependent clauses. I was the only person, I think, at my high school who was excited for like the syntax and grammar units. It just seemed to like make sense of this system that we all use all the time, this language system. I love to like find the rules to make sense of it.
Yeah.
And I've always been interested in speech too, and speech sounds. And so in college, I studied linguistics and psychology. And then I worked in a research lab for a while. And we studied cognitive neuroscience. So it was really cool. I got to work in an fMRI lab and do studies on things like working memory and executive functions. And my goal with that was to learn more about the research world and see if that's sort of what I wanted to do. And I think that is eventually where I'll end up again. But when I was working in that lab, I realized that there's actually a field that sort of bridges this gap between the things I'm interested in theoretically, which is speech and language and the brain, and actually working with people and making a difference. And so sort of through like word of mouth and Googling, it's like, what's this speech pathology thing? And I ended up getting my master's in speech pathology and loving it. And then now I've been working as a clinician since then. So it's been a kind of a fun, wiggly journey here.
That sounds amazing with the courses and the subjects that you have been able to study and then now put into practice. Tell us about, so 2 questions. Broadly, what does a speech and language pathologist do? And then more about your work with schools. Is it with schools?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. So, as you know, this is such a tough question to answer because we do so much depending on where we work. But I would say a speech language pathologist helps people communicate and helps them in a medical setting, they'll help them with feeding and swallowing. And so, in terms of my job specifically, I'm on the communication side of that. And I work in a school full time with preschoolers through 6th graders, and I absolutely adore every grade and I love what I do. So with many of the young kids working on articulation, so their speech sounds and how they're saying them. And then with all grades, working with kids who might have a language delay, or we call it developmental language disorder. So it's hard for them to learn new vocabulary, put words into sentences, listen to a story in class and answer questions about it. And then more recently, I've been branching into the literacy world as well. I've done so many deep dives on the science of reading, and I'm all about that research. And so it applies to what I do super directly, because the more I learn about literacy skills, the more I learn it's like speech and language, but just in a written form.
Yeah. Yeah. It might be interesting to talk about how the interconnections between speech and language and literacy, and how we as professionals tend to compartmentalize those three. But when we're delivering the message or explaining it, we frequently have to explain how they're all interconnected and why working on one part actually will help the workings of other components. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Oh, this is my favorite topic. You'll have to cut me off. I can go for a long time.
Oh, please do. Please do.
So I'll think of an example of like a student I have now, where incorporating literacy has really helped with the speech and language. So this is a young child who has a speech sound disorder. So it's hard for him to pronounce words correctly. And specifically, one of the sounds he struggles with is S.
Yeah.
He also has a language disorder. So it's hard for him to put words together into sentences and really understand what people are saying.
Yeah.
And he also struggles with reading and writing. But an amazing kid, and he tries so hard, and he's so cute. So with him, he's sort of a great case study for me. I get to try out all my literacy skills and see if they transfer across the speech and language side too. So for example, for S, traditionally, maybe like when I was first out of grad school, I might have just done a bunch of what's called auditory bombardment. So having him listen to the S sound a lot in different words and having him imitate me saying it and having him practice just saying it a lot. And that is fine. And that would probably work great to help him say the S. But in terms of the language side, if he's not saying S, he's not putting plural markers on nouns. So instead of saying dogs, he just says dog. Or he doesn't have third person singular S. So instead of he plays, he says he play, which can sometimes be a dialectal thing, but for him, it's not. And so with the literacy skills, then when he tries to go to write these words, he's not going to write them correctly because he's not saying them correctly. And so what we can do is we can, what I have been doing is incorporating letters. So the letter S into our practice as much as possible. So he can make that connection between the phoneme, so the sound, so he can say it, but also the grapheme S, the written letter S. And so when he thinks of S in his mind, he can also think of the letter, and that's going to help him with his grammar when he's speaking, his understanding of what S is, but it's also going to help him read it and recognize it and then write it too. So incorporating letters into my speech and language treatment has really made a huge difference. And I feel like that's sort of the best cue for kids, is to give them the letter instead of, I don't know, I might just ambiguously call it the snake sound, which is fine sometimes, but also we can incorporate the letter.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you so much. So they are your interconnections. And my next question is that with the amount of facets we delve into, how do these interconnections play a part in the child's thinking and organizing and planning? So that bridge between language literacy and cognition.
Yeah, I think there's so many parts to cognition. I can imagine it impacting many of them. So the first thing that sort of comes to mind is memory.
Mm.
And so we know that like working memory, short-term memory, long-term memory that's an important part of cognition. And he needs a lot of support with remembering what the S sound is in order to apply it in his speech and language and literacy skills. So lots of repeated practice to support that. Um, so I think there are many other pieces of cognition too, but that's sort of the one that came to mind.
Yeah, no, beautiful. Because I was just thinking in relation to the students I work with and getting them to compartmentalize, understand the instruction, being able to execute the task, being able to actually remember it for a longer period of time and retrieve that information when they're when the demand for that information is there. And that sort of working from accuracy stage all the way through to now they can automatically do it, to then okay, now it's actually helping their thinking, and it's so that ripple effect, but it needing to be taken really unpacked and stripped down into the smallest skills possible, and then building on those skills, and just
Oh,
how
yeah.
it impacts their thinking and what they have to do or what they don't have to do for that matter.
Yes. And especially for the grammatical piece, for kids who have trouble understanding grammar or longer sentences and syntax, if you take instructions for any task that they do in the classroom, there's so much complex grammar and syntax in that. And or a word problem, even if the math part of it is simple, sometimes the language is very complex. And so this kid I'm thinking of might struggle a lot with that, not because he can't do the math, but because of all the steps, like you're talking about the planning and understanding the instructions, all the steps it takes to get there.
Absolutely. So, Brittany, while one of your role is actually working directly with the students, and within that, take us through the process of what you would do when a student either knocks on your door or is referred to you.
Mm. So I would, if just special ed law and logistics aside, assuming this is a kid who will be added to my caseload and parent has consented for an evaluation and all of that, definitely start with the evaluation. And evaluation is something I'm equally as passionate about because diagnostics are so interesting to me. And so with that evaluation, what I'm really looking at is all of the components of speech and language. And I also have another job where I do evaluations where I can get more into the literacy side. I do some evaluations for a private practice, and they have some great tests like the entails that get into the literacy side too. But in my school job, I do mostly just the speech and language tests. And so I'm looking at how is their articulation or their speech sound production. And then I'm looking at their language, which is phonology, so the sound structure of everything, morphology, so the different parts of word, semantics, word meaning and vocabulary, grammar, syntax, how do they put words together into sentences? And then I try to do some sort of discourse level, so some larger level assessment related to how do they kind of put words and sentences together to make a story. Or if I read them a passage, can they answer questions about it? So, because sometimes kids have all the little component pieces, but then they sort of fall apart when it's a bigger task. And maybe that's sort of what you were alluding to earlier with the cognitive piece and these executive functions. Those can absolutely influence language as well. So start with the evaluation and then take the results of that and figure out a good intervention method for them.
Beautiful. And once you have got all of your data and you've interpreted it, analyzed it, we know that when, as speech and language pathologists working with children, whether it's once a week, once a fortnight, That's okay, but there has to be a team around the child. Tell us about that team component and how what is it like working with a team of the child, and how to make it effective and efficient so that there is the best outcome.
Yes, I love my special ed teams that I've gotten to work with at my current school, and in the past, I feel like I've just been blessed with wonderful people to collaborate with. Um, so I do collaborate with occupational therapists quite a bit. So I actually share a room. In years past, I've shared a room with the OT. This year, she's a wonderful CODA, so an OT assistant. But I share a room with the person who's working on fine motor skills and incorporating some of the sensory stuff and self-regulation. And so just sort of through the organic nature of being next to someone all day, we have collaborated and co-treated on some kids, which has been really fun. So I'll bring the language piece. So it would be great for them to try to say a sentence with prepositions. And then they'll bring the maybe motor piece. Oh, we can practice prepositions while we work on gross motor skills, like hop on the green ball or whatever it is. And then we're sort of targeting both things at once, which has been really fun. But I also love to collaborate with reading specialists, of course, just because of that natural link between what they're saying and what we're working on in their oral language, and what the reading teacher is probably working on is a very similar thing in their written language. So I also love to collaborate with reading teachers and just classroom teachers too.
Yeah, beautiful. And what about the parents? How, yeah, the ease of connecting with them or difficulty in terms of logistics one during the school times, how does that work?
Yeah, I think that because of COVID, uh, everything's sort of changed in terms of how I work with parents in my school. For the parents and families who had the resources to be able to get their kids online for online therapy last year, I felt like I was closer than ever with them, and it was awesome actually, because they were always there for our sessions and we could talk about carrying over skills, and I felt like they really understood what the child was working on, and like the value in that time. But we also know that COVID was and is so devastating for
Mm.
so many families financially and otherwise. And so for those families, I understand that like their child's talking skills comes way after being able to feed them and giving them a safe place to live, and like so it's sort of been um difficult to navigate some of that just through COVID. But in a normal non-pandemic world, parents are the best therapists because you can teach them what to do at home. And then even with some of the virtual learning, it's been cool to really directly teach them how to do that.
Absolutely. And you talked about carryover skills. Let's dig a little bit deeper into it. First of all, what do you mean by carryover skills, and why is that important for the child's outcomes and just treatment plan?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it is the official marker of learning. I don't think that the child has really learned a skill unless they are carrying it over. So also applying it in another context. So typically I think of carryover skills like if I'm working on, I'll just keep on the S train. So if I'm working on maybe helping this child say plural S in my therapy room, I don't care if they can do it perfectly for me 100 times in a half hour if they're not going to understand that they also need to do it in the hallway and at recess and in the classroom and when they're at home. Like, I mean, need to make sure that there is some plan in place where the teacher is maybe also cueing them for it and their parent also understands to cue them for it. and just to build that awareness. So they're not just learning the skill in isolation, like, oh, when I see Miss Brittany, she makes me say these words a bunch of times. But when I see Miss Brittany, I'm working on the skill that I'm also working on actually in my classroom. And my mom is also cueing me for it at home. And that goes back to the team piece. It's so important.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. I kept, when you were talking about carryover from the clinic room or the therapy room to the classroom or to the house, I just kept thinking of bridges, and we are literally working on bridges every time, from the point of that accuracy to competency in whether it's they're speaking something or they're listening to what someone has said, or they're having to read, or they're having to write, or just engage in that social context, which is really interesting. Yeah, that
So
was,
true.
yeah. And we're constantly, yeah, having to sort of find these bridges and actually go, where do we, how do we carry it over? And in fact, if anything, sometimes I find that is particularly the challenge, is they'll be able to do it wonderfully in the therapy room, but it's a, their brain is so used to the cues, so used to the routine, and the minute there's a slight shift in the routine, then there's a different outcome for, and
Mm-hmm.
idea of flexibility as
Mm-hmm.
well for that child. That is amazing. My other question is, working with children where English isn't their first language, do you have an opportunity to do that? And if so, what, how do you approach that scene?
Yeah. Most of my students at my school are bilingual. So they speak many of them speak Spanish, some of them speak other languages at home, and then instruction is in English at school. And I firmly believe that we need to approach these kids from a strength-based, an asset-based mindset. So instead of just how did they learn English? They're not speaking English well enough. They're not doing X, Y, and Z, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
I mean, coming from someone whose job it is to like pathologize and analyze speech and sort of quote fix it, I think we have to change that perspective when it comes to kids who are bilingual, because actually they're coming to us with a wonderful set of resources already. They know, many of my kids will know so much in Spanish.
Mhm.
And so we can use that to bridge this maybe gap between what they know in Spanish and what they're learning in English. And so one example of that is using cognates as much as possible. So words that sound similar in both languages and mean something similar in both languages. And another sort of idea that I've had brewing with one of my literacy friends is more about the grammatical piece. So there's something called a morpheme matrix, which is basically when you just split words up into prefix, root word, suffix. And we want to make a Spanish English morpheme matrix. So some prefixes are actually the same in both languages, like re, re, or re, like it's the same in
Yeah.
English and Spanish. And then S, they have plural S in both languages too. So why not just always be bridging that gap as much as possible throughout the day? So I think it's fascinating working with multilingual learners.
That's amazing. And just the other day, I was listening to a podcast, and I can't remember who the host of the podcast was, but it was with Julie Washington, and one of the recent papers she's written with Mark Seidenberg. And something that stood out very starkly to me was the notion of code switching, and why. So Julie Washington was asked, why don't you use that term? And she's like, well, when, and she explained it so beautifully, and it just sort of, there's some, yeah, explanations that just tend to click. And it was very much going, when we're asking someone to switch codes, there is that bit of notion of one is things have its time and place, and one is right or one is wrong, or that sort of underlying connotation. And why aren't we able to just use both, you know, to for ease of access, or for ease of, or comfort even. Yeah.
Yes, I'm so excited to hear you mention this. I actually I know exactly the podcast episode you're thinking of. I have it here.
Yeah.
Science of Reading, the podcast, season 4, episode 7, linguistic variety and dialects,
That's
difference,
it.
not errors. Yeah.
That's exactly. Yes. Yes.
So I tried to listen to this episode when I was driving, and I had to turn it off because I wanted to sit down and take notes the whole time, and I couldn't do that when I was driving.
Yes.
So I also loved what she said about code switching, and how instead of, I can't remember her words exactly, but it was the point of, instead of teaching kids to code switch, especially when they have to code switch to standard American English,
Okay.
it's actually always going towards, and she didn't use this term, but it's going towards this like monolingual, white, standardized, what is the standard?
Yes.
And that completely erases so much of where they may be coming from, and how they show up authentically. And so I actually have I'm a moderator for the Rhode Island Science of Reading Facebook group.
Okay.
And because that's how deep I've gotten into the science of reading. And I posted that episode, a link to that episode in the group. And one of the quotes I had posted with it was, when we see a child or an adult who is doing something different and they're struggling, we assume that the struggle is due to the difference, but that's pathologizing the difference. And we don't want to do that. So even if a dialect is contributing to a struggle, it doesn't mean that it's a disorder.
Yes.
It just means that it's a difference we need to pay attention to. And it means that we as teachers need to do something differently. So I liked that perspective.
Absolutely. And with what I took away from Dr. Julie Washington's explanation might be totally different from what she was saying, or what someone else takes away from it. But I think there's such a power in allowing for that difference. But also, my other thing is that not permitting that difference to almost be an excuse as well. Like, it has, I think that could be taken either positively, or even in that, oh, because English is their second language, there isn't much we can do about it. But actually, we need to know what the difference is. And so once we do know what that difference is, then we can target it in a specific manner, as opposed to just leaving it. And once we leave it, we know exactly what happens. The gap continues to widen.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, yeah. So that's such a beautiful quote. And I just love listening to those podcasts, and Dr. Julie Washington in particular, that skill of just explaining things so eloquently and stating it simply, but we know that there's such deep knowledge underneath those simple or powerful statements.
Yeah. And it's exactly what you said. I think that was really her point, and we have to understand the difference to make sure that the opportunity gap doesn't widen. And that comes down to teacher knowledge. So we need to be aware that, like, saying F where maybe a speaker, like I might say TH mouth, but if you pronounce it with an F at the end, that is a valid piece of African American English. And it is not something that they need to be referred to me, for example, for speech and language treatment. It's something the teacher can be aware of and say, oh, like that's how you say it. And so that makes sense that that's how you spell it. Here's a different way. Here's how you might do it, when we're writing in class or whatever.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And actually, after listening to that particular episode is when, so we have a similar thing in Australia as well, with the articulation of as a substitute for TH sounds, and then going, all right, we need to correct this straight away. And, even a few years ago, or like up to last year, I would have said, yes, I understand that, because I see that sort of link between the speech sound word itself and then into the literacy component. However, after listening to this episode, I was like, wow, yeah, we really do need to avoid placing that judgment, but actually explaining, or trying to explain it differently and going, okay, this is what we will be using in the classroom, but really trying to do it without that judgment, because we don't really know where what the other part of the story is.
Yeah. And I think I projected my own ideas. Dr. Julie Washington didn't go so into, whiteness and that standard, but I think that is sort of related. And when we think of racism and how that shows up in insidious ways in the classroom from sometimes very well-intentioned teachers, this is one of those ways, thinking of it as systemic, like it's happening in the school system because this is what we're trained to do, and so we need to catch ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Back to your chapter, Brittany. So we've covered what your role is as a speech and language pathologist with the child, when working directly with the child, when working with the child's team, when working with their parents. Are there parts that I've missed out? Something you do that is incorporated into your working and your system that helps create awareness of communication and literacy, the importance of working on these aspects, or even identifying children early? How do you go with that education component or awareness component?
Yeah, it's something I'm trying to do more of. What I have been doing is trying to lean into moments and sort of insert myself into staff meetings. That's the honest way to say it, and say, hey, can I talk to the staff for 10 minutes about syntax, like during our staff meeting? And then our admin miraculously says yes. And then so the other day I had this like quick presentation on syntax. I was like, here's what it is. Here are some red flags. If they're not doing this or putting these types of sentences together, maybe refer to me. And here are like 5 simple ways you can embed syntax practice into your classroom. And so that's one way. And I think that some teachers have found that helpful, but it's hard to know what to focus on because there's so much in our field, and I wanna spew information at people all day, but I also recognize that they might not always want that. So I'm still working on the awareness piece, definitely.
Yeah. And the other phrase you've mentioned is science of reading. What is it?
So the science of reading is basically this body of research and knowledge that we have over the past few decades that tells us the most scientifically or evidence-based sort of way to teach reading. And so what does the research say about word recognition? What does the research say about language comprehension? And what does the research say about all these pieces in between? So it's basically just referring to this huge body of research referring to best practices in literacy.
Yeah, there you go. That's beautiful. And it's taken from different components of, there is your phonics, but there is the way the brain works, and actually how it all amalgamates together for this outcome to be possible, the language part. And where do you get all of your, like, in terms of professional development, your own capacity building? How does that work as a professional?
Well, this is a terrible answer, but
Yeah.
Instagram is amazing.
Yeah.
So I learned about so many, not just from like professors and people who are very renowned in the field on Instagram, but also they'll post about talks and things they're doing on Instagram. And then I learn about it that way. So honestly, social media.
Which really actually since COVID, last year, March, social media has really, Facebook's, Instagram, it's really ramped up the amount of quality information that's being shared. And again, we've talked about bridges. One of the massive or the longest bridge has been from theory to practice. And in order to sort of mitigate that bridge, all of this quality webinars and information and PD, the chunk-sized PDs have come out, which has been so helpful. And all those recordings being made permanent and freely available has been an absolute blessing in disguise.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And tell us about so you said you've been a speech and language pathologist for 4 years, and have you been working in the same school for 4 years?
Um, yes, I was part-time in my current school and part-time in a different school for my first year. And then my second year to now, I've been full-time in my current school. So yes, but in a full-time capacity, just a few years.
Beautiful. Take us through a little bit of that journey. What did it start off like at the beginning of the 4 years, and how has it evolved or transformed to what you are doing now?
Um, well, it's so funny thinking back on my CF, so my clinical fellowship is what we call it here. I don't know if it's the same in Australia, but that first year working out of grad school. And we it's sort of unique. You don't usually work in two different places for your clinical fellowship year, but that's just sort of how the cards fell for me. And so I worked 2 days a week in this school I'm in now. And I was only working with grades 3 to 6 then. And then I was working 3 days a week at this private school. And both experiences really have shaped how I approach my clinical practice, especially at the private school. It was such a unique experience because it was a collaborative, it's this unique school model where every classroom has a speech therapist, an occupational therapist, and a special educator. And so every week you're meeting together and you're collaborating on lessons. And throughout the day, all day, it's sort of like co-treating and carrying over skills and those things that we talked about earlier. All day, every day throughout the day. And because the school is so small, the team is able to sort of carry over those skills. So while I didn't stay at that school,
Yeah.
I have taken that collaborative nature of things, of working with kids, and absolutely still try to do my best to do that in the public charter school that I'm in now.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And the essence of that collaboration, because it really works towards meeting the child's needs, yes, but actually meeting them as a whole person as opposed to pulling parts of that child
Oh
into.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've even started trying to co-treat with the social worker at my school, because there are some kids who meet with me and then they meet with the social worker separately, and it's usually worked out fine, just seeing each of us separately, but their communication is integral to whatever they're processing and talking through with the social worker. And then similarly, their mental health and well-being is critical to the skills that we're working on too, and how I'm showing up with them and how they're showing up with me. And so having us all together, uh it's amazing, because then I can learn from her and I can watch her modeling calming strategies, or I can watch how she navigates when they maybe say something that I wouldn't know exactly how to respond to. So it goes past just special ed interventions, but also I think there's a lot of amazing just collaboration that we can do with mental health providers too.
Absolutely. And you talking about mental health sort of triggered my question, but in for speech and language pathology, there is the concept school to prison pipeline, which is a really well-known one in our field and one that's being researched quite thoroughly. There needs to be more research into it, but the idea is that the communication barriers or difficulties in communication and literacy are leading to different paths or different trajectories, which aren't great trajectories for our students. And early intervention is key. Have you witnessed that particular component in your work with the students? Their mental health or their different impacts of why we do what we do.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the most obvious example that comes to my mind is reading, because we know that a lot of, at least in the US, a lot of adolescents who are in prisons read at less than a fourth grade reading level. And I can't remember the percentage, but it's an extremely high percentage, and have a language or learning disability. And that is, when you think about all of the legal stuff that they have to navigate at such a young age, if they also have difficulties maybe reading what their lawyer showed them or understanding what's going on in the court because of the vocabulary or the complex language, that is just, it's so unfair to have them go through that. And I think it starts even way before they get to that point. And my job is more of the hopefully more of the preventative piece, and helping them just build all of those communication skills so they're able to rely on them, however their life, whatever journey they take, and equip them with that success, and hopefully, lead to less of this pipeline.
No, beautiful. Thank you so much for that, Brittany. We'll have a couple of wrap-up questions, but is there anything, I know we've talked really broadly about a lot within your chapter, but are there things you've wanted to share that I haven't asked or something? Yeah, just things that I haven't touched on.
I mean, the only thing that came to mind was when we started talking and I mentioned music.
Yes, that's right.
I just love that that connection between language and music, and I have always found it so interesting. So I'm fascinated by that.
Do you use music in your interventions?
So I do sometimes. And I'm definitely not a music therapist. But the way that I think it's most easily incorporated with young kids. So when I go into the preschool classrooms at my school, actually just this past week I ran a circle time and we sang a little song together. And I think that especially for those young kids when they're 4 years old and you sing them a song that maybe has a certain word in it that you're trying to teach them, like the music just helps it stick so much better. And then as I'm walking past their classroom later in the day, I hear them singing the song and they're practicing that word. And I think it's just such a fun way to incorporate language practice without them sort of even knowing it in this very play-based setting. But also with older kids, I think sometimes when they know something is academic, like if we're working on complex syntax and complex language, sometimes they shut down immediately. And so I think there are ways we're using song lyrics that they really like, or incorporating a topic, and usually they're interested in music to some degree, incorporating that topic as sort of a door into working on these language skills. We can talk about, like, let's talk about Drake for 30 minutes. Like, we can do that and practice subordinating conjunctions. Like, that works for me. So I think that I try to do it, but I don't do it as much as maybe I want to. So it's something I always think about incorporating more.
That's interesting. Yeah, I found music quite interesting in terms of, as you said, it sticks better in the brain. And if there were complex concepts, for instance, actually, there's a YouTube channel. Is it Dan the Rocking Man? And
Sounds awesome.
yeah, he actually has got a song for the writing revolution, Because But So. I'm pretty
No, really?
Yes, I am pretty certain.
That sounds awesome.
There are a few different, I think it's him, Dan the Rocket Man. And he has a
because I always use that because but so sentence framework. I would love a song.
You'll have to check him out. He has, yeah, he does. He has Because But So, the basic conjunctions song. And then he has the vowel helpers.
Okay, you have to send those to me on Instagram.
Okay. Yeah, but he has quite a few interesting videos, and it's about all of these concepts, but again, putting it into music. And that is something, yeah, just another mode of helping our students, or adults for that matter.
Yeah.
The other question, which I should have asked this earlier in our conversation, but sort of thinking about syntax, why is it important? First of all, what is it? And then why is it important that as adults, we need to have more knowledge on syntax, and being more mindful of it for our students?
Syntax is my favorite. So syntax is basically the rules that govern our word order and our sentence structure. And so when we think of English, it's things like our sentences usually have subject verb order, or subject verb object order. And then there are certain rules for how we can make sentences more or less complex. So in terms of my intervention, I'm really looking at, most of my kids speak in very simple sentences. So maybe they say, I don't know, I woke up, I ate breakfast, I came to school. Giving them more complex syntax would look like teaching them to say, after I woke up and ate breakfast, I took the bus to school. And so putting those ideas all together actually into one but more complex sentence is a very powerful tool for them in terms of their oral communication. But it's important for teachers and interventionists to be aware of as well, because academic texts have so much complex syntax. They have many, many different clauses, and often require a lot of syntactic expertise to be able to parse apart, okay, what is this word referring to 3 lines down here, even though the noun it's referring to is way up here, and all of this stuff in between is just like clauses, extra clauses describing this word. So it's really complex in academic texts, and kids who struggle with language and communication often struggle with reading comprehension because of that complex syntax. So it's important for the oral skills and also for their reading.
Absolutely. And the other piece I was thinking about is when we as adults are giving a student instructions, and particularly from a classroom standpoint. So you are providing instructions to every child in that classroom, but a lot of the times those instructions can be quite complex, not only what they have to do or that numerical value within the instruction of how many parts there are to it, but how we have formed that sentence can also be quite complex. complex, and that's where the syntax comes in to play.
Yes.
As well, and that's that oral language part of it, I suppose. And
no, it's both the production and the comprehension of complex syntax, and so you're sort of getting at that, the comprehension of complex syntax in a teacher's direction. So many teachers will give, like you're saying, very complex instructions without even realizing it's very complex. So it's like, before you line up, put your book in your bag and put your pencils away. And so for my kids, understanding the before you line up part, like that is going to be lost on them. They're just going to go line up, and maybe the teacher thinks they're being defiant, but really that's all they processed was you line up, right? When they didn't hear the pencil and the book and all the other stuff. So absolutely, it's definitely something to be aware of.
Yeah, beautiful. And the final, do you have any key takeaways for anybody listening to this chapter?
I guess just make sure you're aware of your complex syntax in your instructions. If there's one thing I want all teachers to know, it's actually that. But no, I think, and maybe also just the collaboration piece is so important. I think for anybody working with any child anywhere, is just working with the whole team, the parents, the other teachers, the other interventionists. So that might be the takeaway.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Brittany, for spending this time talking about your passion, your love for language and literacy. And I hope, the chapter connects with a few people. And for anyone that's listening, if you think that this chapter will connect with your friends or your networks, please feel free to share it. And I will try to share some of those links. Actually, maybe that podcast episode with Dr. Julie Washington, Dan the Rocking Man's YouTube channel, that will be really good. And what about the Rhode Island Facebook group? Is that something that's accessible to international audience, or is it just for Rhode Island? What?
It's actually just for Rhode Island educators, but there is another group called Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in College, and that one is open to anybody, and it's like the huge group. We're just one small chapter of that, and so you can join that Facebook group, which is an amazing wealth of knowledge.
Beautiful. Thank you. So we'll put those links in the notes. Awesome. Thank you so much, Brittany.
Thank you so much. This was so fun.